So we have the great pleasure and honor to welcome Dr. Andrew Selee today, who is coming especially from Washington, D.C. Dr. Selee is currently president of the Migration Policy Institute, which is, as far as I know, the only think tank, worldwide think tank devoted to migration issues specifically, and worldwide because there is also an office in Brussels, which Dr. Selee also chairs. And as far as I know, it's the only one that exists. So he's one of the best, if not the best, specialist of migration issues in the world. And so it's such an immense honor to welcome him today in Paris. So Andrew became chairman of the MPI in 2017. Prior to this, he had worked for 17 years at the Woodrow Wilson Center. And if I may give a personal note, when years and years ago, one of my best contacts on US and Mexico retired, John Bailey of Georgetown University, I asked him who I could talk to after his retirement. And he told me, you know, not really with universities. The best person is with a think tank. Andrew Selee is a remarkable person and is with the Woodrow Wilson Center. So that was at the very, very beginning of the 21st century. And we've known each other since then. So Andrew Selee holds a PhD in policy studies from the University of Maryland. Before the Woodrow Wilson Center, he held a number of jobs, including as a staff member of Congress. So he knows his way in Washington wonderfully well. He knows Latin America, is quite fluent in Spanish, and he knows Latin America perfectly well also, in particular Mexico. So he's the epitome of the link between the United States and Latin America, and particularly Mexico. His latest book is Vanishing Frontiers, and you know that there is a lot of talk right now about building a wall or finishing a wall that is already partly built. So for Andrew, he doesn't talk about the wall, but rather about vanishing frontiers. So his talk today will focus on migration in the Americas, showing divergent policy responses in an era of increased movement across borders, that is, making a comparison between migration responses in Latin America and in the United States. So the talk will be in English. We discussed that even a few minutes ago. We thought that some people maybe here would not understand Spanish. So the talk will be in English, but Dr. Selee will be more than happy to take questions in English and in Spanish, and will put some Spanish into his talk as well. Thank you so much.
I apologize profusely for not speaking French today. It would be incredibly useful. I will speak in English, but I will flip into Spanish occasionally just to highlight a few points. And I've intentionally decided to do PowerPoint. I don't always do that, but I figured that was useful also since we're in a multilingual audience here. And there are a few interesting graphs too. So good morning. It's a great pleasure to be here at the Institut des Amériques. Thank you, Isabelle, for the opportunity for the invitation, the opportunity to be here, and for a long friendship and professional colleagueship as well, both. It is a pleasure to be here, and I'm going to talk about migration. And migration has always been a subject talking about Latin America, but when we talked about migration in the past, we were generally talking about migration from Latin America to somewhere else in the world, to Europe, the United States, Canada. I'm going to talk about some of that migration, but I'm also going to talk about a huge migration that's going on within Latin America. And this is a relatively new phenomenon. Certainly there has been migration in the Americas before now, but not in the scale that we've seen in the past 2 or 3 years, and certainly the past 5 years, which is what I'll focus on. So let me start off by saying, yo voy a hablar de la migración en las Américas. En otros momentos habríamos hablado de la migración de América Latina hacia el resto del mundo. En estos momentos, sin embargo, estamos viendo una migración enorme dentro de América Latina también, una escala que no habíamos visto antes. So this is, I've turned it on my, let's see, there we go, the technology. Okay, the Americas are on the move. We are seeing a probably unprecedented number of Latin Americans moving right now. And this is largely because of Venezuela, but not exclusively. Venezuelans, we've seen 4.3 million people, at least. The numbers are almost certainly much higher. These are the UNHCR, IOM figures. But the numbers are certainly much higher than this in reality. And there's some other people doing studies through Facebook, postings, trying to follow people on Facebook that come up with much higher numbers, but I'm being conservative here. So 4.3 million is what UNHCR, IOM tells us. Most have left in the most recent period. So, I'll come back to those numbers again. We've also seen in the past year and a half, so hay 4 a 5 millones de venezolanos que han dejado su país en los últimos 5 años, la mayoría en los últimos 5 años. 70 to 100,000 Nicaraguans who have left, almost all of them going to Costa Rica. We're already about 300,000 Nicaraguans in Costa Rica. There's a large community, but this is a very new, recent arrival. And they talk about themselves as exiliados, as exiles, actually. Y hemos visto de 70 a 100 mil nicaragüenses en el último año y medio. There's also somewhere between 1.5 million and 2 million Guatemalans, Hondurans, and Salvadorans who've left their countries, mostly headed north to the United States. Most want to go to the United States. There are a few, actually, Hondurans and Salvadorans headed to Costa Rica and Panama. But and there are some headed to Europe, actually, to France and Spain, to Italy, to Belgium. But the vast majority want to get to the United States, and perhaps increasing numbers staying in Mexico, voluntarily or not very voluntarily. We'll come back to that. But so this is a large number of people. And then Haitians and Cubans, I mean, there are large Haitian communities. This goes back to 2010, goes back further than that, but especially since 2010, probably 178,000 in Brazil or more, 120,000, 128,000, I think is the official number in Chile. 11,000 is the official number in Mexico. The number's almost certainly much higher than that. Cubans, various places around the hemisphere, also Chile, Ecuador, Mexico, among other places. And there are still Colombians, by the way. For the Colombians among us, there are still, yes, Natalia, there are also Colombians still that can, even though Colombia is the biggest recipient country right now of migration, Colombia continues to have a large number of people who leave. Entonces, hay centroamericanos, hay un montón de 1.5 a 2 millones, mayormente yendo a Estados Unidos, algunos quedándose en México, y haitianos, cubanos, colombianos y otros grupos también. The thing that distinguishes this moment is that almost every country in Latin America, other than the ones mentioned here, are receiving migrants. So Latin America has become, almost all Latin American countries, except for those that are the major sending countries, have become recipient countries for migrants, often on a very large scale, very quickly. And they've gone from seeing themselves as primarily immigrant societies, because almost all had some immigration, to suddenly dealing with being immigration countries. So hay un cambio en muchos países. Todos los países aquí no mencionados son países de acogida de migrantes. Entonces hay un cambio enorme en el hemisferio. De los países que eran expulsores de migrantes, de pronto se volvieron recipientes y países de acogida de migrantes. We're seeing 2 divergent patterns in the hemisphere. One in Latin America and the Caribbean, which is a relative openness to migration, mostly to Venezuelan migrants, and in case of Costa Rica, to Nicaraguan migrants and others. At the same time, in the United States and Mexico is pulled in both directions, but ultimately is pulled into the U.S. system, and I'll come back to that for obvious reasons, much more closure towards migrants. And so I'm going to talk about 2 divergent pathways. These are not, I don't want to over-exaggerate, because Latin American countries and Caribbean, I'll talk about the Caribbean a little bit as well, are yet coming to terms with what their immigration policies are. And there are signs of great openness, but also of some closure going on. So it is not an undifferentiated story. There are different things happening. But overall, what we've seen at this moment has been a general desire to receive migrants as they come in and keep the door open. At the same time, in the north, we're seeing the door close, at least for the migrants from Central America. But again, I don't want to exaggerate because the U.S. is also the biggest recipient country for immigrants around the world. So it's, it's not as though the door is closed in the United States, but it is certainly getting harder and harder to get across the U.S.-Mexico border for reasons I'll talk about in a minute. Let's start with Venezuela. Let's start with the biggest migration within Latin America. I may mention Nicaraguans here and there, but Nicaraguans primarily go to Costa Rica, a few headed to the United States, a few to Panama. So I will focus mostly on the Venezuelans. At least 4.3 million Venezuelans, por lo menos 4.3 millones de venezolanos que han salido del país, de los cuales 3 millones han salido en los últimos 2 años. 3 million people have left in the last 2 years. So we're talking about a very recent phenomenon. This is either a mixed migration or a forced migration, depending how you want to talk about it, which is to say people are leaving sometimes for explicitly political reasons. They are leaving because they are in disagreement with the government and they were pursued, and many people have this case. I mean, not because, many people left years ago because they were the top political leaders, but you find a lot of lower level political leaders or simply people who participated in protests who left because of that. I talked to someone the other day who had left for Trinidad who was simply a government employee who her boss discovered she was out protesting and started to get reprisals. So people who could be considered refugees, with lots of people who are leaving because the country is collapsing, because there is a breakdown of the usual order, that health services are not working anymore. The currency is not worth very much. And by the way, if you go to Bogota anytime soon, you will see Venezuelans on the street selling Venezuelan currency. Some of it actually sewed into purses. I should have brought one, actually. Gave one to my daughter the other day. They make purses out of Venezuelan currency. And it's partially a way to make a living, but it's partially a political statement as well of the collapse of the country, right? Because schools are in critical situation, because it's hard to maintain a family, because people are hungry, because you actually see people being malnourished, right? Are they political refugees? Are they forced migrants? Are they economic refugees? It's very hard to tell, right? And so what we've actually seen is, I tend to use forced migration in this case because it is a case, or mixed migration, where you can't really tease out whether someone's a political refugee or they're an economic refugee, because there's a continuum when the state is collapsing around you. But this is becoming true increasingly of many migrations around the world, right? There are fewer and fewer migrations that are explicitly political. Syria, Rohingya, you could name a few, but fewer and fewer of those, and more where people's motives are mixed, right? And where it's hard to tell who's an economic refugee and who's a political refugee, and the old definitions may not hold. Most of these migrants from Venezuela have stayed in Latin America, over 80%. The main migration is the corridor that is Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Chile. But you also have a large number in the north of Brazil, Trinidad and Tobago, which is 6 miles away, Guyana, Curaçao, Aruba, which are essentially border states as well. They're all very separated by small bodies of water, and then large numbers in places like Argentina and Mexico. So, la mayoría de los venezolanos se han quedado en la región andina de Colombia hasta Chile, pero también un número significativo en Brasil y también en las islas de Trinidad, Aruba, Curazao, y Guyana también. Here's the numbers. No, I keep forgetting to actually give you, there we go. Here are the actual numbers. So Colombia's got 1.4 million Venezuelans, most of whom have come in the last 2 years. That is a large number of people. Hay 1.4 millones, por lo menos, de venezolanos, la mayoría que han llegado en los últimos 2 años. That is a large number of people, okay? This is beginning to look like the Syrian crisis in terms of numbers, not necessarily in the causes, but in terms of numbers. Peru has officially about over 800,000, probably closer to 1 million. Ecuador has 330,000. Chile officially, they have one country that did a count. Any Chileans here? Congratulations, the Chilean census service really works. 288,000. All the rest are estimates. Brazil about 180,000, and so on and so forth. You get to some countries like Trinidad and Tobago, and you say 40,000 people. That's not a lot, except that for the size of Trinidad and Tobago, it's quite a lot. The size of Costa Rica has 29,000 Venezuelans and then maybe 100,000 Nicaraguans. That's more than 2% of the population. arriving in the past 2 years. So significant numbers. In the smaller countries, the numbers aren't as big, but they're significant in terms of what it means for the local society. You know, Brazil, 180,000 people in Brazil is probably less than 29,000 people arriving in Curaçao in terms of what people feel, right? Or 40,000 people arriving in Trinidad, 36,000 in Guyana, for example. Entonces, esos son números enormes. Rival está muy cerca del tamaño de la crisis de Siria, en números, no en causas, pero en números. Y estamos viendo números muy altos en algunos países de recepción. Sobre todo los países como Colombia más cercanos y luego los países muy chiquitos que tienen número grande en poco tiempo. The countries in the region have actually, for the most part, tried to keep their doors open to people arriving, often explicitly so. And I won't go into detail on this. We can talk about this more if you want in question and answer. But there was an existing array of mobility agreements, the Andean Pact, Mercosur, UNASUR. There was an attempt in the 2000s to bring Latin America together and create not just a common market, but, and actually CARICOM, which I forgot, the Caribbean Pact as well. So there was a number of mobility agreements and a lot of bilateral agreements that were allowing people to move. Some of these have stayed open. And some countries have gone out of their way to make it possible, like Colombia, for Venezuelans to come in legally. They actually have done a special visa that allow Venezuelans to come into Colombia legally. Other countries like Costa Rica, for example, with Nicaragua, went out of its way to expedite visas as quickly as possible to get people in. But there's been an attempt to keep doors open, although this is starting to change. And so we've seen in the past year, Chile first, then Peru, then Ecuador, and slightly different than Tobago have really started to put requirements in place. So requirements for visas and requirements for passports, which that sounds normal, right? You get on an airplane, you need to have a passport, you probably need a visa where you're going. But for a Venezuelan to get a passport is incredibly expensive. It's a long process, and it signals to the government that you're leaving. And so it's very hard for Venezuelans to get passports. It's expensive to get visas. And so the question of actually keeping the doors open has been important because it allows people, when they would take your identity card, which was the way it operated in most countries, and it still does in Colombia with a wrinkle. You have to do a process, but you can get into Colombia still. It was very easy to move to another country. With the passport requirements, which you now have in Ecuador, Peru, and Chile, it actually makes it much harder for average people to get into the country. We've also seen in Latin America an attempt to regularize, so lo que dije ahorita es que ha habido un intento muy fuerte de mantener las puertas abiertas. Está empezando a cerrar un poco, pero una política de visas en general muy laxa en América Latina que permite que los venezolanos entren sin visa, aunque recientemente está empezando a cambiar y hay más requisitos en algunos países, sobre todo Ecuador, Perú y Chile, para que la gente pida pasaporte y visa para entrar. There's been a regularization of status in several countries, and so Colombia and Peru were the first two to do this, and Brazil actually, decided, although Brazil is slightly different, but Colombia and Peru created a figure, it's called the PEP, the Permiso Especial de Permanencia in the case of Colombia. It's the PTP, it's the Permiso Temporal de Permanencia. Yes, I know, realize it's a temporary permanent permit, but nonetheless. In Peru, they created figures that allowed Venezuelans to stay in the country. De la noche a la mañana, they did it from one day to the next. They actually simply created, through presidential decrees in both countries, a figure that would allow people, Venezuelans specifically, to stay in the country with legal status. In the case of Colombia, it gives you access to almost all services, healthcare as well as education. In the case of Peru, it gives you access to very basic services, but it allows you to actually become a permanent resident within a year. It's quite generous, actually. Over 1 million people went through those two programs, and they created them out of nothing. These were migration agencies that really had never done very much, and they actually all of a sudden said, you've got to go out and legalize people. They actually came up with a way of doing this. You could highlight lots of problems in how they did it, but they did it. In the end, about 1 million people got, and imagine this in France or in the United States or in many, or the UK or, many countries, the ability to legalize, in Colombia's case, 600,000 people in a period of a year. I mean, that was a huge political and bureaucratic effort to actually make this happen, or 460,000 in the case of Peru. Brazil also created, but using a little bit of Mercosur figure that they created a special visa for Venezuelans as well. Ecuador has one that is supposed to start. They're supposed to start a legalization later this month, actually, in October, if though anyone who's following Ecuador from Ecuador, you know that there's some questions about where the government is at the moment. I think they've fled to Guayaquil, the latest we saw. But in theory, later this month, this will start in Ecuador as well. Entonces, ha habido procesos de legalización, de regularización de estatus para venezolanos en específico, bastante generosos en Colombia, en Perú y con otra figura en Brasil también y ahora en Ecuador. Colombia is now, because politically it's getting harder to do major legalizations, they're now trying to do legalizations of people who have work in the formal economy, and all students, which is their new way of doing this. Argentina and Uruguay have been even more generous. Any Argentinos y Uruguayos here, raise your hand in pride, because they have, despite the fact that Venezuela is suspended from Mercosur, they have actually allowed Venezuelans to come in as members, as though they were members of Mercosur. You do have to have a passport, but once you get there, you can actually get a temporary residence permit that allows you to work, and you can eventually become a permanent resident as well. Despite all this, I mean, I should say there are a lot of people, probably about half of the Venezuelans are still in irregular status, because as much as this has been done, it is still insufficient for the number of people arriving, and the programs didn't always get advertised in a way that would get to everyone. Asylum systems, however, are overwhelmed in most of these countries. I'll come back to this in the United States. Asylum systems are completely overwhelmed. Asylum is used in some countries as a way of letting people in, or at least giving them a temporary permit while their asylum case is pending. Costa Rica does this, for example. Peru used it as an entry point. They required the passport, but if you would ask for asylum at the border, they would let you in. They would document you. And so they began to use asylum as a way of documenting people and allowing them in. They've now pulled back from that, but they did this for a long time. Costa Rica uses it as a way with the Nicaraguans of giving people a permit to work for a period of time. Even knowing that they probably won't give them asylum eventually, it's become understood that that's the way you do this. Mexico and Brazil are the two countries that are actually fairly generous with asylum. For Venezuelans, very much so, and Mexico applies what's called the Cartagena Declaration, which has a very broad understanding of asylum beyond the Geneva Convention. And so it basically says the disruption of order or generalized violence, and says all Venezuelans qualify for that. Brazil now says the same thing, just changed, and now says the same thing. Central Americans do not necessarily get Cartagena protections, but they have a very high success rate for asylum in Mexico. And I will come back to that because Mexico is contradictory here. Mexico is mostly in the US system, except for this. Mexico has an overwhelmed asylum system, but Mexico is actually, between asylum and complementary protection, which it grants to a lot of people if they don't get asylum, actually has a very high grant rate, way over about 70% actually with Central Americans, and close to 100% with Venezuelans. Efforts to integrate migrants in Latin America, we can talk in the Caribbean, we can talk about this later. I mean, this is either a huge success story or a huge failure, but I'd say it's more of a huge success story. Every country except for Trinidad and Tobago is the outlier, every country has allowed new arrivals, whether or not, excuse me, I keep forgetting to change this, so, okay, here we go. There, okay. Have allowed students to go to basic education whether they have legal papers or not. Okay, so hay acceso a la educación básica para estudiantes si tienen o no papeles legales in all the countries but Trinidad and Tobago. And Trinidad and Tobago is a real outlier in this. We can talk about that more if you want. And probably the hardest place to be a Venezuelan migrant these days. Access to higher education and emergency health care is accessible almost everywhere, including Trinidad, actually. If you are about to give birth, if you are in an accident, almost every country will give you, well, legally every country will give you access to emergency health care. It gets more questionable, however, depending what you have. If you have tuberculosis, depends which country you're in. Right? And, if you have bronchitis, maybe tuberculosis, yes, bronchitis, no. I mean, every country begins to divide this differently. Higher education is less accessible for people. Recognition of credentials, one of the huge issues, and we can talk more about this later if you want, huge issues is you have a lot of professionals who've left from Venezuela. You have doctors and dentists and teachers and engineers. Very few countries other than Argentina have figured out how to recognize people's credentials in an efficient way. And even Argentina is making its way through this, but Argentina has devolved it to the provinces and made it much quicker. Most countries are trying to figure out how to do this. So you have lots of doctors driving Uber around capitals in Latin America right now. Any big city, if you get in an Uber, you're likely to find a Venezuelan. So You know, if you go to construction sites, if you go to comedores, you're likely to find. So, you know, there isn't much of an agenda on immigrant integration yet. But in some ways, because many of these countries, other than Chile, have huge, and Trinidad to some extent, are basically have huge informal economies, people do manage to integrate in the labor market. You know, again, they're not going to be able to exercise their profession if they have one, but they do integrate in the labor market. You know, and with or without papers, they do get their children in school eventually. Sometimes it takes time to get their children in school, but eventually get their children in school. They have emergency care. People manage to survive, and at the same time, there isn't yet a proactive agenda to how to integrate people. So relative openness. Latin American and Caribbean countries have largely tried to protect migrants, not usually using asylum, but using other legal forms. They've provided access to basic services, education, emergency health care, but not yet figured out some of the other integration questions, right? I mean, how to actually bring people fully into society. So, en general, sí que no hay gran apertura en América Latina para dar protección a los venezolanos que han llegado, también a los nicaragüenses de Costa Rica. Hay dar acceso a cierto estatus legal, por lo menos para muchos, a servicios básicos, pero ya no hay una agenda de integración más amplia todavía. And there are now in some countries efforts to limit entry to Venezuelan migrants, although as near as we can tell, because borders are so porous, what this is doing in countries like Ecuador and Peru and Chile is that people are going around, they're going por la trocha, as they say in Colombia. People are going through irregular channels. So the numbers haven't really gone down. People are going through different ways to get there. And some countries, I mean, since I don't think we have any Peruvian press here, I can say some countries like Peru, for example, what they're doing is, even though they have a visa for Venezuelans to come in, they know that if they apply that strictly to everyone, everyone's going to come in illegally because it's very easy to get around the border crossings. And so what they've done is they've found lots of exceptions because they'd rather have people documented in the country. And so they're finding lots of ways of documenting people to bring them in. Things look a little bit different up north, where I come from. Las cosas se ven muy diferentes al norte, de donde vengo yo. In the United States, needless to say, the Trump administration has focused excessively on slowing irregular migration since at least 2017, when Trump came to office. This is the big, beautiful wall that he wants to build. Initially, the focus has been building on a wall, but then they moved on to family separation and criminal prosecution for illegal entry. Both of these efforts have largely failed. We do not have a wall yet. We have 70 miles of replacement wall, and they are starting on about 20 miles, if I'm not mistaken, of new wall. But we do not have a wall on the border with Mexico. I mean, we have a wall anyway in about 600 miles of the border with Mexico before Trump. But we don't have a lot of new wall there. So that hasn't happened. Family separation and prosecution for illegal entry was largely abandoned, at least prosecution of families for illegal entry. And it actually may have led, some of these efforts may have actually led to what happened in 2019, which was a huge spike in Central American migration, which has now led to a series of different measures I'll talk about in a second. First of all, some numbers. Mexican migration has gone way down. This was the story. If we had had this conversation 10 years ago, we'd be talking about this number. These are Mexicans trying to get into the United States. These are apprehensions. We don't know any other way of trying to document who's crossing from Mexico to the United States. So we always talk about apprehensions, who actually gets caught. These numbers were almost certainly higher because they didn't catch a lot of people in the early days. Now they're actually catching most people. But the number's gone way down. There still are Mexicans. There'll be somewhere between 150 and 200,000 Mexicans who'll be apprehended at the border this year. So it's not nothing. But some years it was 1.6 million. So, you know, this is a diminishing number of people. Tends to be family reunification or young people, young men trying to get across. Almost all single people, very few families. The news story is this. The blue is Mexico. So this is Mexico you see declining. The red, the green, and the purple is Central America. Entonces, esto es la nueva migración. El número de mexicanos ha bajado, que es el azul ahí, y el número de centroamericanos. Ahí tienes El Salvador es rojo, Guatemala es verde, Honduras es morado. Eso es la nueva migración que llega a la frontera con Estados Unidos. Esas son aprehensiones, son detenciones en la frontera México-Estados Unidos por nacionalidad. And the last, if you see that little blue bit at the top there, those are people from other countries. That's actually 9%. That's almost 1 out of 10. Take note of that. That's actually Haitians, Cubans, Cameroonians, Congolese, Bangladeshis, Indians, Nepalese, others. 9% también son personas de otros lados. So hugely changing number. Overwhelmingly, we're talking 75%, we're talking about Central Americans. And this is what we saw, let's see, this year. So I'll come back to this. This is the huge surge that happened February, March, April, May, and then begins to drop. This was a surge that was almost all Central Americans coming to the border. And these are also more families. So we're actually seeing 56% so far this year. This is through August numbers. We got the new numbers yesterday, but this through August, 56% were families, 8.9%, basically 9% were children. Look at the old migration. When it was Mexicans, it was mostly individual people, small numbers of families and children. Now we're seeing mostly families and children. The Central American migration is primarily families and children. Okay, es una migración de familias y de niños, menos individuos. Y los individuos son en gran parte son mexicanos. Los centroamericanos son mayormente familias y menores no acompañados. This is actually a terrible graph because this is only through, I think, March. But increasingly, these are asylum seekers also. So if we had this all the way through 2019, you'd see the number go up even more. Increasingly, people are applying for asylum. This is also a mixed migration. It's a different mixed migration, however, than Venezuela. And we've also, and I'll come back to that in a second, and we've seen Mexico increasingly deporting people. So starting in 2015, Mexico actually starts deporting more Central Americans than the United States. Now, it's not quite the same thing to be deported from Tapachula as to be deported from El Paso. A lot of people are deported from Mexico or able to come back fairly soon after that, right? So it's not quite the same thing. But Mexico started deporting people at very large numbers. What's going on in Central America then? Why 1.5 to 2 million people have left? One is gang violence, incredibly high, some of the highest homicide rates in the world, high levels of extortion, high levels of kidnapping in some places. In some places, political instability has worsened, particularly Honduras. If anyone is following the trial in New York, by the way, of the Honduran president's brother, you know about that. Guatemala has been through a rough patch as well. Poverty, drought, low coffee prices, few opportunities. But also, and this is worth noting, people probably have a little more money than they used to, a little more access to cash. So poor, violent, but with a little bit more money, which means you can actually pay a smuggler. And you have more money either because you have a relative in the United States, or you have more money because, perhaps because these are countries that actually have grown in the past few years. Truly poor people migrate in the immediate neighborhood or within their own country. People who are able to pay $6,000 to a smuggler tend to be people who are able to get that money through their family networks, usually not alone, but through their family networks, sometimes on credit with the smugglers, and at the same time don't believe that it makes sense to invest that money where they are, right? Things are still so bad where they are. If I start a little store, I'm going to be extorted, so I'd rather use that for a smuggler. If I expand my farm, if I buy some machinery, coffee prices are still so low, I'm not going to really get into the cash economy. So people have a little bit, this is what we saw in Mexico 20, 30 years ago, right? People start to have a little bit of money, enough you can pay us, and your decision is, do I pay a smuggler or do I invest where I am? Well, it makes no sense to invest where I am, pay a smuggler, all right? But there's also another, and there's family reunification, but also, and here I will echo Donald Trump. Don't throw things at me. But there is also an attraction of U.S. immigration laws, which it started to be very clear that it was actually fairly easy to apply for asylum in the United States. And it was actually, if you're a family, if you bring a child with you, the U.S. cannot hold you for more than 20 days. And people started to figure this out gradually, but they really figured it out because of one thing that Trump did, which is family separation. The family separation story in Central America was big news. And it ended in failure because it was a policy that Americans didn't agree with in the end, and he had to abandon it. But what it did do is give the smugglers a talking point. And smugglers took that information and went back and said, mira, ya no están deteniendo gente. Las familias los sueltan en 20 días. Aguántate 20 días y te van a dejar ir. Go now, because they're not holding people for more than 20 days anymore. You just saw the news stories here. They tried to, but they're not going to do it. So if you take your kid with you, you're going to get out in 20 days. You're going to be in miserable conditions. Yes, you're going to be, kids in cages, whatever you want, but you're out in 20 days. And by the way, that's true, was true. So the smugglers actually, the Trump administration played a huge role in actually increasing this migration because they gave the smugglers the talking point. This is what happened. So what you have is, I will go back to this. You see this starting to go up next year after family separation, and then really in January it starts to take off. The Trump administration got smarter, also more cynical, drastic. You could use lots of adjectives here. Trump has wanted a physical wall, but what he has actually built in the past few months is a bureaucratic and geographical wall. One, they forced Mexico under the threat of tariffs in June to begin an extensive enforcement campaign. So the numbers you saw in attention have gone way up. The Mexican government I should have put pictures here. I actually have some pictures of the Mexican National Guard. I went down to the southern border of Mexico and wandered around for a while. I mean, they actually really have put the National Guard and every other police force they have on the highways, at the border. There's still people crossing. I took pictures of people crossing, actually, at clandestine points. I mean, there are still people crossing, but it has become much harder to cross through Mexico because the Mexican government decided that they did not want tariffs and that they would do anything. After a period of talking about openness to Central American migrants, they suddenly decided, we know which side our bread is buttered on. We know who we need to actually be good to. It's Donald Trump. It's not the Central Americans. And they have thrown everything they can at stopping Central Americans from coming through to please the Trump administration. So that's the first wall. But there's also a bureaucratic wall. And that is, it's three components. The first one is the Migration Protection Protocol. It's an Orwellian name. Entonces, primero, el gobierno mexicano sí ha cumplido con las amenazas, con el deseo de la administración Trump de hacer un control migratorio que no existía antes. Ya había control, pero uno mucho más fuerte. Pero también hay un muro burocrático que se construyó. So the bureaucratic thing is, first of all, the Remain in Mexico policy. They sent 51,000 people back to wait for their asylum hearings in Mexico. So with families, they have to release them in the U.S. after 20 days. They said, we'll release you, but we're going to release you in Mexico. And they forced the Mexican government, again, with the threat of tariffs, to increase this program, which had started at the end of December. And so you have 51,000 people, give or take, some people have gone home, waiting for their U.S. asylum hearings in Mexico. It's hugely discouraging. Secondly, they've struck asylum agreements with Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras to send people back for their asylum hearings in those countries instead of the United States. Those are not operational, but they're out there as a communications message, and they're trying to get them going. And finally, they did something called the Interim Final Rule. Don't ask me how an interim final rule that is interim, that means like a temporary final rule, can be so powerful. But they came out with a rule saying that if you came through a third country, you have no access to the U.S. asylum system. You should have applied for asylum somewhere else. So basically no one other than Mexicans can get asylum in the United States today. Can get asylum who comes to the U.S.-Mexico border. You can still get asylum if you can fly into the United States and ask for asylum, but you can no longer get to the border and ask for asylum. Now, it's not clear this is being implemented yet. I mean, it seems that these are rolling these out stage by stage, but what they've done is constructed a series of bureaucratic barriers that make it very hard for people to come into the United States. Now, they're either really strong bureaucratic barriers or it's a house of cards, because all of these three measures are subject to litigation. The second one, not yet. The asylum agreements haven't started, so they haven't been litigated. But Remain in Mexico, there's a court case going on right now. The asylum travel ban will be discussed in December in the courts. All of these could actually, the asylum ban seems the most likely to be defeated in the courts because it seems to go directly against what's written in the law, that not giving people access to asylum. But all of these could also prevail. But right now, at this moment, the numbers are going way down because it is, in fact, very hard to get into the United States and ask for asylum. Okay, so what explains, this is my last slide, and then we can have a dialogue on this. What explains these divergent responses? On one hand, you have a much more open response. En español, por cierto, el muro en lo que se conoce burocráticamente hace casi imposible que uno pida asilo en Estados Unidos. Hay una prohibición de pedir asilo si pasaste por un tercer país. So, si eres centroamericano pasando por México, hay acuerdos con Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras para deportar, para remover gente de esos países para que apliques asilo en esos países y no en Estados Unidos, aunque no está en activo todavía. Y también está el Migration Protection Protocol, el Quédate en México, que es lo que permite que mandan gente a México para esperar su audiencia de asilo en Estados Unidos. Entonces, es muy difícil en este momento entrar a Estados Unidos de forma indocumentada o por medio de asilo. So what explains these divergent responses? And with this, I'll end. First of all, geopolitics. The countries in Latin America have mostly decided that Venezuela, and in the case of Costa Rica, Nicaragua, these are major political issues. They have spoken out about what's going on. They are outspoken on the situation in Venezuela and in Nicaragua, and therefore there has been a lot of political pressure to be congruent in also receiving migrants and refugees from those countries. So geopolitics plays a huge role in this. In the United States, the Trump administration has framed the Central American issue not as a mixed migration flow, but as a group of economic migrants and who are abusing the asylum system, and therefore we can treat them as simply an illegal flow that needs to be stopped. Secondly, there are different historical trajectories on mobility. There was an increasing integration going on in Latin America and the Caribbean. There's a broader definition of asylum under the Cartagena Declaration, which is what you've seen quite different from what we see in the United States, where the U.S. has made a 30-year investment in trying to close off the U.S.-Mexico border from people trying to arrive. And finally, and related to that, there are different capacities of immigration enforcement. I went to 4 borders over the summer, actually. I went to the I go to the U.S.-Mexico border a lot, but I went to the Mexico-Guatemala border, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Colombia, Venezuela, and Colombia, Ecuador, in sequence over a 4-week period. And one of the things you see is that the borders are incredibly porous. If a Venezuelan wants to get into Colombia, they will get into Colombia. If you're Nicaraguan and you want to get to Costa Rica, your biggest problem is getting by Nicaraguan authorities, but not the Costa Rican authorities. We actually at one point surprised some Costa Rican immigration officers who were hanging out at an outpost and had not seen anyone in a very long time. It's very easy to get around Costa Rican migration, and they know that. I mean, it's very easy. The Colombians have no pretense of shutting down their border. It's impossible to shut down. You cannot shut down the Peru-Ecuador border or the Ecuador-Colombia border. This is true throughout the Guyana-Venezuela border. It's hard to stop people even coming in a boat to Trinidad and Tobago or Curaçao. So, I mean, the capacity is different. Even if countries want to do this, the choice is ultimately between, do you want people in the country legally or do you want them in the country illegally? Because you don't really have a choice of stopping them. The U.S., as it turns out, does seem to have a choice and is actually, under the Trump administration, trying to move forward. Although, and with this I'll finish, I think we're going to find that even with all the bureaucratic instruments and using Mexico, people are going to find ways around this sooner or later. And so we will continue to see an increase in the U.S. undocumented population as well if we don't use some of the tools that Latin American countries are using to regularize people's status. So thank you. Gracias. Do we have time for a few questions, or is this?
Of course, we have time. Any question in English or in
Sí,
Spanish?
en español,
here?
perdón, yo quería decir más en español y se me pasaba siempre por la emoción.
Hi, I'll ask the question in English.
Sure.
So the numbers are certainly very interesting, and I can definitely understand the divergent response that you explained at the end between U.S., Mexico, and the rest of Latin America. But what I find pretty striking is the divergence between what seems to be a sort of regional solidarity in terms of the integration within Latin America. So the difference between that and how we see integration in other regions. I guess we could talk about the Middle East or even in Europe. Obviously, regional contexts are very different, but I'm just wondering if you can see if these same explanations apply to why the Latin American response to within region migration is different from other regions. So I don't know if it's the same thing, in Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey when it comes to welcoming Syrian migrants. I don't know if my question makes sense.
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, yes, I think it's different in the sense that there's language, religious affinity, cultural affinities, historical affinities. I mean, Venezuela, by the way, was the country everyone else moved to for a long time, right? So for Colombians, for example, there were 500,000 Colombians living in in Venezuela. I'd even mention there's 400,000 Colombians that have come back from Venezuela. Colombo, Venezuela, some of them have never lived in. I mean, some of them are Colombian by nationality, but it's their parents actually that moved to Venezuela, and many others moved as children. So they're culturally, and there are many mixed families, right, that are Colombian Venezuelan marriages. So, I mean, there was a huge amount, everyone, every country in Latin America had at least some people going to Venezuela, right? I mean, and certainly Colombia as a next door country. So, and huge affinities between Costa Rica and Nicaragua, incredibly economically interrelated. There's a historical Nicaraguan community in Costa Rica. It's not an equal relationship. It's always been Nicaraguans going to Costa Rica, but still there's a huge interdependence there, right? I mean, I think it's 8 or 9% of the Nicaraguan population is actually, the Costa Rican population is born in Nicaragua. It's a large number. Costa Rica, by the way, is the only country in Latin America that has more than 10% of its population born abroad. There's more like Europe, actually, in that sense, or the United States or Canada. That almost even Colombia, probably it's 2 or 3% of the population right now is born abroad, even with the number of people that came in. That said, so yes, and I think there's a history of solidarity, there's cultural continuities, there's this Bolivarian dream. Bolivar, was a terrible political theorist, but he was actually a successful cultural theorist in some ways. And so there is this, anhelo de integración, this sort of desire for integration in parts of the region. At the same time, there were also instruments that were created. I mean, there was very little migration, attempt to create these mobility regimes. So the Andean Pact, very easy. Once you get into Colombia, you can actually, until recently, you could move on to Ecuador and Peru and Chile. Ecuador and Peru, you could move on extremely easily because there was an agreement on IDs. And though Venezuela came out of the Andean Pact early on, it was very easy to say, but we still recognize you, right? I mean, we'll still grant you the same mobility rights. Mercosur, Venezuela goes out of Mercosur, but the Argentines and the Uruguayans say, but you know what, you're still hermanos de Mercosur, we can still consider you at your time of crisis. What I do worry about, though, is that we are starting to see some of the same xenophobic backlashes. It's not happening at a political level as much. I mean, you see in Colombia, for example, all the political parties signed a pact against xenophobia. A couple candidates tried to run campaigns against Venezuelans in local elections, and the parties responded and actually sent joint letters saying, don't do this. I mean, there's a policing of this still, but we're only 2 years into the mass flow. We're 5 years into sort of the big flow, but 2 years into these extreme numbers. And I do think we could end up in a situation much more like Lebanon or Jordan, where there's an acceptance, una anuencia, but no longer that sense of solidarity, right? Where you can't stop it, but at the same time, it's a real desire to contain it, which is what happens in other parts of the world. And so I think there may be a pushback eventually.
Jim?
And we've seen it, by the way, in Peru, I should say. One of the things that the Peruvian government did is they put this humanitarian visa on, which sort of said, we've got control of the flows, but then they passed it on to the migration authorities. The migration authorities said, we will, obedezco, mas no cumplo, mas no obedezco, right? Or the other way around. I'll do it, but sort of, so what they did is, humanitarian visa for everyone, unless you already have a family member who's already in the country, special needs, pregnant women. They started to create lots and lots and lots of exceptions. So there's this sense of control, so they actually pushed back on xenophobia. They stopped some of the xenophobic attacks because there's this sense of control, but they're actually letting people in at large numbers anyway. So it's a very smart thing to do, actually.
Yes, hello. I have a question concerning those asylum seekers who do still manage to get into the United States in small numbers.
Yeah.
It's never been very clear to me, and I asked this question while traveling in Arizona this summer. It's not quite clear to me by what criteria it is decided that some can remain free and can contact family members and be sent on buses across the country to join those family members while waiting for their hearing, and others who find themselves in individual or family detention. How is
this done? Not clear to us either. I mean, families have to be, there's actually a ruling from 1997, a court ruling. Flores, right. So the Flores Rule was a judge who said unaccompanied minors, children who were traveling without an adult, could not be held for more than 20 days in detention. It was expanded in 2015 to include children traveling with family members. You can't hold anyone under age of 18 And this is part of the surge of Central Americans, right? I mean, this is that in fact, very few people knew about this, but those that did, could actually started to discover that in fact, families would not be held for more than 20 days. So families are almost always released within 20 days. And Mexicans are the exception. Mexicans are exempted from, there's all sorts of things that Mexicans are exempted from and Canadians. But it's certainly true for families from every other part of the world. With adults, they can hold them for as long as they like, but in reality, and some people get held for very long periods of time, but in reality, there's not enough bed space to hold people, especially when there's a large number coming during the surge. And so, and what they're doing now, actually, as near as we can tell, I mean, there's chaos right now on the border. Chaos in trying to figure out what to do. What they seem to be doing is screening people, first of all, to see if they can put them, even before they ask for asylum, which they're not going to get at this point. They see if they are eligible to go into the Remain in Mexico program, the Migrant Protection Protocol. And if they are, which most people are, they're just sending them to Mexico and giving them a date of a hearing in the courts where they can show up and ask a judge, an immigration judge, what relief they want, if any. But it is an incredibly opaque system. And I think they're having trouble figuring out what they're doing.
To me that Remain in Mexico has been rolled out everywhere along the border. It's still...
No, it's rolled out most places at this point. I think they managed to get it almost everywhere. It may not be in Reynosa yet, but it's almost everywhere else at this point. And they set up courts literally in tents. Some of them with video screens in tents, actually. The judges aren't even there. Because that's the only way they could do it, yeah. And Remain in Mexico has its own series of problems. I mean, the reality is, you send someone back to Mexico, wait for a U.S. asylum hearing, it's almost impossible to get an attorney, right? You can't get an attorney to come see you, a U.S. attorney to come see you in Mexico. There's a lot of hearings being missed because they change your hearing date, but there's no way to contact people, who aren't walking around with a smartphone, right? They're in this interim condition. And it's obviously a huge problem in Mexican border cities because these are people who may or may not stay in Mexico. They can't really get a job, a permanent job in Mexico. They're incredible prey for criminal elements in cities that already...
Some people call it muerte en Mexico.
Muerte en Mexico, sí. No. I mean, it is in so many ways a crazy program. But it worked for their purposes, which was to try and stop this huge surge. So it did actually succeed in doing what they wanted it to do. But whether it's going to survive, I have some questions once this gets to the courts. Yeah. Hay otras preguntas. También en francés. If anyone wants to ask in French, please, Isabelle speaks French. She can translate. So, yes, I apologize for my lack of French ability.
Good morning. My name is Fernanda.
Fernanda, good morning.
I am from the southern region of Brazil.
Bom dia.
Português,
Yes.
français e un petit peu d'anglais. And I study family reunification policies applied to Haitian immigration. Because the south of Brazil is a strong migratory route. I asked for suggestions for family reunification policies in Latin America. Thank you.
Interesting. And I should say, by the way, one of the things that Brazil is doing with the Venezuelans, which it was on the slide, but I forgot to mention it. I'll come back to your question, but it's called interiorization. Interiorização. Yes. Eso, that is what they're calling it, yes. Where they're actually this is very smart. Most people are Venezuelans. The Venezuelan border is next to Roraima, which is the poorest state in Brazil. And the idea, and people it's the one place where there are actual refugee camps, including 2 indigenous refugee camps. And it's not an ideal place to insert people into the labor market, obviously, for people to stay permanently. What the Brazilian government has started doing with NGOs and the IOM is moving people to other parts of Brazil. And they've actually done this now with about 20,000 people. There's about 180,000. Some make their way elsewhere on their own. But there's 100,000 plus living in Roraima. They've taken about a fifth of them already and moved them to Sao Paulo and Minas Gerais and other places, Rio de Janeiro, other places where there's more of a labor market. And of course, Brazil can do this because Brazil is a huge country, right? I mean, Brazil, first of all, And Brazilian military is involved in doing this too because they're fairly structured. And then they've contracted with a number of international NGOs. But it's a very thoughtful way of doing this, actually, of trying to get people to places where there could be jobs, since they are giving people legal status. On family reunification, I mean, one thing we do know is that people, the earlier you can reunify people with their families, the better outcomes for the children, the better outcomes for the spouse in the labor market. So it's incredibly helpful to do it. Are there ways of doing it? I mean, there are countries, including France and the United States, that go out of their way to privilege family reunification. We're sort of outliers, actually, in the developed world on this. Most countries privilege more work-based visas. And I don't know if there's I'm not sure I have specific remedies for this. Training, obviously, in the United States, we do a lot of work on training, especially for spouses. And also, how do you think intentionally about in education systems where you have large numbers of foreign-born students, which is something that hasn't happened much in Latin America. We've tended to assume that since most people coming into Spanish-speaking Latin America speak Spanish, they don't need to be integrated, but it turns out they don't know many of the things that you need to know to be in elementary or secondary school, and that's certainly true if you're talking about Asian migrants to Brazil, right? I mean, there's a huge knowledge gap that you need to pick up, and so figuring out, and language gap, so figuring out how you integrate people into schools in a proactive way matters a great deal for later outcomes. And Mexico, there are a few Mexicans here. Mexico's had to deal with this, by the way, and now Central America, Mexico's been a little more proactive, trying to figure out how to deal with returnees, because actually Mexico, by the way, I took out one slide here, which is of the immigrant populations in Latin America. Largest immigrant population in Mexico by far? Americans, right? About 1 million, officially 700, I don't know, I think it's 820,000, but probably over 1 million. But mostly, I mean, lots of different backgrounds, but large numbers coming back with parents who've returned to Mexico, right? Culturally Mexican, but nationality and educationally Americans, and don't know a lot of things you need to know in a Mexican school. I mean, it turns out everyone assumed it looks Mexican. They can just pick up where they left off, but don't know any of the history, don't know the modality of teaching, turn out, and often have never studied in Spanish. So, may speak Spanish, but don't know how to read Spanish. And so it actually is an integration issue. And so I think we often forget these integration issues at our peril.
Yeah, one more.
Thank you. I'm walking in the border between Colombia and Venezuela from the last 7 years.
Yeah. Where at the?
Yeah, Cucuta, and then in the other side, San Cristobal.
Okay.
And actually, I'm very interested in the way on how illegal groups, and criminal groups are working in this border.
Yes.
So for them, migration has been a great income, actually. And then they are using this migration, mass migration, to provide in any way kind of labor force into the way on they are acting. So I was wondering if you have been doing research about this subject. I will be very interested to know a little bit about that.
We haven't done research on that, but we've talked to a lot of people who have pointed that out, and you can feel. I mean, I was actually I went to La Guajira the other day and stood on the bridge between Venezuela and Colombia, and it's a complete. Fortunately, I was with someone from UNHCR. I mean, I felt slightly protected that I had someone with a blue vest with me, but I knew as soon as I got there that we were entirely in the hands of organized crime. Multiple organized crime groups, that the state presence was completely irrelevant there. I mean, you could feel, a few people came up to us at different points to figure out who we were and what we were doing, because we stayed for about an hour and a half on the bridge. So it was, they were trying to figure, it's not really a bridge, it's just a passageway, but, they were trying to figure out who we were. It's a little less brazen in Cucuta, but there is a huge, I mean, these networks of organized crime existed ahead of time. These have always been at every border. There's always smuggling of different kinds. And most of the movements still between Colombia and Venezuela are people going back and forth in regular transit and people going, back and forth to buy things. Or in the case of La Guajira, a lot of it's actually the gasoline coming from, it smells like gasoline at the border, actually. It's great. It's not great. But I mean, there really is a huge amount of smuggling that's always gone on. And this is true of borders everywhere, right? I mean, this is probably true between Germany and France, right? I mean, this is true between Germany and Denmark. It's just more hidden. But it's certainly true where borders are more porous, right? And controls are less. And so, it's very out in the open. And so, yes, this has been a huge boon. I mean, the money changers, the people who people send their money to Cucuta, and then it's taken across the border because that's better than sending it straight to your bank account, and you may not have a bank account in Venezuela. There's all the commerce going back and forth. And then there's, for the people that come in illegally, which is still a very large number, they pay a quota for going in, right? So there's usually a certain amount, and I think the latest in some places around $10, give or take, for each person to be able to get across. And usually you pay to the Venezuelan army or someone tied to the Venezuelan army to get out of Venezuela, and then you pay, depending on which trocha you're going through, which illegal crossing you're going through, you pay to whoever's on the Colombian side as well that controls it. And there are probably some that aren't controlled, but a lot of them have a local criminal group that controls the entry. And then they're recruiting some of these people, right? I mean, in Cucuta, you've got a huge number of people who are floating population who can't find work. And so these are also easy prey to get involved in any sort of illegal enterprise. And in Colombia, you've got, the remains of an armed conflict and remains of drug trafficking. I mean, you have sort of multiple conflicts overlapping with migration in ways that are potentially quite explosive. In places like Arauca and other places too, I mean, even more so, right? Where you have ELN and FARC and paramilitares and drug traffickers all getting together and doing different kinds of businesses on both sides of the border in Colombia and Venezuela, and then you have a bunch of unemployed people. That's an explosive combination. So, yeah.
There's another question here.
Thanks. Do you see any room for progressive migration politics in the U.S., especially taking into account the coming election of next year?
This is a good question.
Yes, it is a good question. Isabelle, who knows the United States well, should I tell them my Monday story?
Yes, please.
Sure? Okay. Before I got on the plane to come here on Monday, my last job at MPI, we had our big annual conference on U.S. immigration law and policy. And so my last job was to introduce the Secretary of Homeland Security, the acting Secretary of Homeland Security, because we have, very few people in the U.S. government these days who actually are confirmed in their positions. It didn't end well. We had a group of protesters there. He actually, I have to say, is one of the people you can exchange ideas with. I disagree with him on many things. We've criticized many things that he's done, but he is someone that we actually, feel listens to ideas here and there. Seemed ready to come to engage, but we actually had a group of protesters that wouldn't let him speak and actually decided to leave in the end, which tells you how polarized our politics are. Okay, so that was my last experience before going there. Well, I sat through a couple panels, but the last thing I did before leaving. The United States is deeply polarized on this issue, and it's deeply polarized on this issue not because immigration normally would be such a hot topic, but because Donald Trump has made it such a front and center issue. Right? I mean, immigration rates are high in the United States, but until this surge, frankly, unauthorized immigration, irregular immigration, illegal immigration has been going down for a long time. And now it's back down to where it was, actually, as of this past month. So it's down to historically low levels again, actually. So yes, there's immigration. There's a lot of people coming to the country. Immigrants are quite skilled in the United States. About half of all recent immigrants to the United States have a college degree. They are more educated than the rest of us are, than those of us who are native born. So in some ways you would say, why are we having this debate now? And there are reasons. The changing American economy, demographic pushbacks, right? I mean, this is a society that is becoming less white, things you've dealt with here, cultural changes that come with that. Huge uncertainties about people's jobs, whether it's caused by immigration or robots or trade. I don't care. I don't want any of those, right? I mean, if you're in a job where you think you might lose your job at some point, you don't wait to blame the robot or the immigrant or the trade agreement. You don't know which it is, but you know your job is vulnerable. So there's lots of reasons why immigration matters, but it shouldn't have the prominence it does. I mean, objectively, the economy is doing well. People are, for the first time, we're actually seeing even people at the lower rung are starting to get a little bit of that benefit that wasn't happening before. legal immigration's down. Objectively, this shouldn't be as big an issue as it is, except that it is the president's #1 issue. Because it's the president's #1 issue, and it's his dividing line, and it's an emotional issue with a key part of his base, it is then an emotional issue on the other side. Okay, so that's the preface. So can anything happen? The Trump camp is divided, so if Trump wins, there is a part of his administration led by his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who are trying to do some sort of legal immigration reform around immigration as competitiveness. I think that comes up against the Stephen Miller branch and the people who see immigration as a threat to the country and actually want to cut legal immigration as well as stop immigration at the border. You know, if Democrats win, yes, I think Democrats actually, because this was Trump's signature issue, they don't have very clear policy ideas, but they know that they have to do something on this issue because it's now become an issue that matters to the base of the Democratic Party. And so, yes, it's not clear to me what will happen. And part of our fear, and this, I mean, literally has sunk in, I would say in the last 3 weeks with us, I suspect that if some of the immigration measures that Trump has imposed, particularly on asylum, survive court challenges, a Democrat may leave them in place. And I say that because in the end, they're convenient to anyone who's in government, right? If it's hard to get asylum in the US, why would I start up asylum again and then risk people coming to the border in large numbers? Now, what a Democrat could do is, and so this has gotten us thinking, so what we're doing a Rethinking U.S. Immigration project where we're trying to actually think what would a rational immigration policy be. Okay, if that's not gonna happen, you know, option one is we should go back to having a robust asylum policy at the border, but if that's not gonna happen, do you do asylum in country? Do you have a more robust refugee program that includes Central Americans in a much more direct way? You know, do you try and have a safe zone in Mexico or Costa Rica where people can go and apply for asylum, you know, under UN auspices, UNHCR auspices? So you have to begin to think creatively. So I think the answer is yes, but I also wouldn't expect a Democrat to come into office and immediately reverse everything because they will take some of the things that Trump has done as the status quo and start from there. And that's the problem with policy change in general, right? I mean, what is done by one administration is not always undone by the next because it's convenient to them. So. But, you know, and if we could get back to the conversation, the thing we keep saying to Democrats too is you should frame this as an economic argument. We need workers in the United States. And we need workers at all levels. We need talent, you know, we need talent in Silicon Valley, but we also need talent in agriculture. Right? I mean, we need talent in domestic work. We need talent in the medical industry. It comes across all levels of American society. And we need to have a more flexible immigration system, right? One that can actually turn on when the economy is good, one that can slow down a little bit when the economy isn't as strong, that gives it some credibility to American workers also, so they don't feel it as competition.
Well, thank you so much, Andrew, for this brilliant talk and for sharing all your expertise with us.
Thank you,
It
Isabelle.
was a great talk and a great moment to share with you.
Merci beaucoup.